Time and space, two simple words that mark some of the most elusive and mysterious concepts known to mankind, yet form the very foundations of everything we know. And mainstream science would largely have you view it as nothing more than a vast maelstrom of chemical chaos and random particles colliding by chance. But what if that silent field of light stretching across the darkness was never simply there by coincidence, just waiting to be admired, but a carefully structured map waiting to be read, lingering in the night sky like a language older than any alphabet, a message written across the heavens in a grammar so precise and so enduring that the people who first learned to speak it knew it had to have come from a much higher source, a greater underlying intelligence connecting it all together, one that could only have come from the gods themselves. That's not a poetic way of saying something vague. It's the literal belief of one of the strangest and most quietly unsettling civilizations that ever existed. A people who appeared in the river valleys of southern Mesopotamia so fully formed, so thoroughly organized, and so mathematically sophisticated, that scholars have spent more than a century trying to explain how they got there so fast. A society that believed that every single second that ticks by, every carefully counted minute that quietly dissolves into the next, was never an invention of our own making, but something far older. And if you could go back and ask them, they would tell you that the framework we have used to measure our entire lives, the 60 seconds in a minute, the 60 minutes in an hour, and the steady progression of the stars, all of it stemmed from a design that was already there, embedded in the very fabric of the cosmos itself, long before anyone thought to write it down. A knowledge that did not need inventing because it was woven into the light of those same stars, right from the very beginning, learned, carried, and handed down through generations by a civilization so ancient and so thoroughly forgotten that most people have never once paused to wonder where it all came from. These are not small questions, and they don't have any easy answers, because they carry the weight of something that lies much deeper, hidden just beneath the surface of things, something far more out of place than what you'd normally expect. And the trail it leaves doesn't begin with tests conducted in the last few hundred years, or any typical academic university. It begins in some of the world's most treasured museums, in fragmented artifacts made of the same sun-baked clay from which they were recovered, in the heart of ancient Mesopotamia. Artifacts left behind by a civilization so strange and so sudden that scholars are still puzzled by it to this day. And the answers they've found, buried in the sun-dried clay of ancient Sumer, are in many ways more extraordinary than the questions that led to them. Because this is a story that does not follow any straight, linear path, it moves in all directions at once. It begins with the stars, and it ends with the stars, and everything in between is an attempt to understand what the people looking up at them actually knew. On one side of it, there are the raw oddities of their origins, the Sumerian problem, the question of how a civilization with no obvious predecessor arrived with a complex language, a working calendar, a numerical system of breathtaking complexity, and a record of the heavens so detailed it still impresses, as it should. These are people who understood and applied the mathematical principles behind the Pythagorean theorem, well over 1,000 years before Pythagoras himself was even born. The first to use a working numerical approximation for pi around 4,000 years ago, long before it had a name. They didn't simply stumble into any of this. That much was clear from both what they said and what they left behind. It was organized. It was deliberate. It was, by any fair measure, a society far ahead of its time. But what's harder to explain is how they accomplished any of it to begin with. Then, on the other side, there is the far longer arc of what they built with that knowledge, and what came from it. The centuries of careful watching and counting and recording that eventually produced some of the oldest and most precise astronomical documents ever recovered from the Earth. Both of those stories matter. And tonight, both of them are a part of the same journey. But what makes it genuinely difficult to look away from is how consistent the Sumerians were about where it all came from. They didn't take credit for it, not in the way you might expect from any other civilization recording its own achievements. Instead, embedded in tablet after tablet, running through the earliest myths and the most technical astronomical records alike, there is the same recurring claim, that the knowledge was given, that divine teachers were sent at the very beginning, handing down the framework of the sky to the first human watchers who were ready to receive it, that the mathematics, the geometry, the careful charting of planetary motion, none of it was invented by them. It was inherited from a time long since forgotten, a time even they could barely reach back to, a time when the gods ruled the earth. That claim has made serious researchers uncomfortable for a very long time, and, understandably so, it doesn't fit neatly inside conventional frameworks. But when you sit with the actual evidence, when you combine the science with the artifacts pulled from collapsed archive rooms, it becomes harder to simply set that claim aside. Because for anyone looking at these clay tablets covered in coordinates and angular measurements, carved by hands with a precision that should not have existed at that stage of recorded history, one thing becomes clear. Something was happening in ancient Sumeria that doesn't follow the usual pattern, and the deeper we go into their records, the more evident that becomes. There is a numerical structure at the center of it all, quiet, almost invisible, but absolutely foundational. One that the Sumerians used to divide both of those two elusive concepts as though they'd already mastered it, giving both time and space a structure so well suited to the mathematics of the heavens that we have never found a reason to replace it since. Even after 5,000 years of continuous development, it lives inside every clock ever built, inside every circle ever measured. It is older than any civilization most people were taught to remember. And it points, very deliberately, upward, to the sky itself, and to the way they carved it into sections, tracing invisible pathways across the dark. Distinct bands arcing overhead, each belonging to a different divine deity, each populated by a different set of constellations that would eventually become the foundation of every star map that followed. The lion, the bull, the scorpion, names that are still in use, shapes we still recognized, sciences and calendars and measurements that are still practiced in some form or another by millions of people, most of whom have no idea that its roots were pressed into wet clay by a priest standing barefoot on a mud brick platform somewhere in the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, thousands of years ago. And what we're exploring tonight is how all of it came to be. Not just the artifacts and the tablets, though those are remarkable enough on their own, but the fuller arc of it, the wider perspective they themselves fought so hard to see, from the beginning, tucked away in the earliest settlements where the first sacred knowledge was said to have arrived, all the way to the later chapters in the cities that followed, where that knowledge was tested again and again against the sky, night after night, across generations, until the patterns became visible. Two parts of the same ancient story brought together under the same night sky, where we witness a history we are all a part of, just as those of us listening are all a part of this story now, connecting us all together in a way that only the whispers of our ancestors can. So if you are listening to this in the quiet of the night, Let us know where and what time you are joining us from in the comments section below. There's something comforting in knowing that right now, in different corners of the world, in different time zones and different climates, countless people are all drifting slowly into the same ancient tale. And if this kind of history for sleep narrative is something you find yourself returning to, consider subscribing to the channel, or joining the Legends of the Dawn membership for longer, uninterrupted versions. Your support goes a long way toward helping us to keep bringing these stories to you each week, and it helps other people find their way here when they're searching for somewhere quiet to land at the end of the day. So close your eyes if they're heavy, and let the story come to you slowly, because this is the kind of exploration through history that asks something different of you than the kind you are taught in mainstream studies. It doesn't always move in a straight line. It doesn't begin with a tidy date or end with a clear conclusion. It moves the way starlight moves. Outward, in all directions at once, reaching out for things you didn't quite expect, and arriving from distances that are almost impossible to fathom. Distances that can carry us all the way back to a time when mankind stood in the open air of a world blanketed in genuine darkness. And above them, the night sky would have been something that most of us have only rarely seen. A field of stars so dense and so bright that the darkness itself seemed almost secondary. They looked up into that immensity with all the devoted patience that their civilization was built on. The first ancient astronomers and high priests, the first people to look into the majesty of the night sky at those twinkling embers scattered across its vast tapestry, and question what those distant lights were, where they were going, and what deeper meaning may be hidden within their eternal light. But to glean a hint of what they saw in the darkness, we must first go back to the dawn, to their beginning as they knew it, deep in the heart of ancient Sumeria, to what may be the oldest city known to mankind, Eridu. The first city the Sumerians believed had ever existed, a very real prehistoric capital that archaeology has placed at the southern edge of ancient Mesopotamia, in the very cradle of civilization, where the land flattened into reeds and the air carried the salt of the Persian Gulf. Before any measurement had been made of the night above, before any priest had pressed a stylus into wet clay to record what the moon was doing, this was where it all quietly began. The sky turned, the stars wheeled, the waters reflected that turning back at anyone who thought to look, and nobody yet had a word for what an hour was, or a season, or a year. There was only the vast, unhurried turning of everything, with no human framework laid over the top of it. That was the world before time was recorded, and it did not last for long. Something changed, something tremendous in the historical context, because nearly all of their records, dating all the way back to even the oldest Sumerian texts, speak of a morning when beings emerged from the deep. From the furthest reaches of the Apsu, the sacred subterranean freshwater source that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, beneath the marshes, beneath Eridu itself. These beings rose from those southern shorelines in the forms of men wrapped in the skins of fish, half human in their appearance, and entirely otherworldly in their purpose. 7 of them, known to the Sumerians as the Apkallu, the 7 sages. And if you think that number sounds familiar, or that figures like these appear in places beyond ancient Sumer, you would be right. Variations of these 7 divine teachers, sent to instruct early humanity, appear in ancient Indus Valley lore, far later Babylonian and Assyrian texts, in Persian traditions, in Greece, in the Bible, in the mythology of cultures that had no obvious reason to share the same story. That kind of repetition tends to stay with you. The Apkallu were said to have been created and sent directly by Enki, the god of wisdom and water, one of the most powerful figures in the divine order of the Anunnaki gods. Enki was the one credited with breathing life and intelligence into humanity, and these 7 were his emissaries, his gift to a world that was not yet ready to organize itself. According to the texts, they came long before the Great Flood, before the city of Eridu had become what it would quickly become. They walked among the earliest kings, the ones the Sumerian king list describes as having descended from the heavens, and they taught. That is the word the sources keep returning to. They taught. Now here is where the Sumerian understanding of these events becomes genuinely interesting. The knowledge the Apkallu carried was not something they had developed on their own. It had been handed to them already fully formed, already whole, the Anunnaki, the great gods of Sumerian belief, those dwelling both in the heavens above and in the deepest recesses of our earth and oceans below, had already assembled the full set of instructions for how civilization was supposed to function. And that full set of instructions had a name. They called it the Holy May, essentially the cosmic blueprints to the universe, or at least that is the closest translation to what the Sumerians meant. What the May contained was staggering in its scope. Reading and writing, the proper conduct of kingship, the crafts of the smith and the builder, the rituals that kept the divine order intact, the rules governing how a city should be organized, how the land should be farmed, how a temple should be maintained. To a modern reader, that might sound like a collection of useful knowledge, but to the Sumerians, the May was nothing so simple as a list. It was understood to be a living force, a concentrated essence of universal order that had its own presence, its own weight. When the goddess Nanna famously obtained the May from Enki in one of the most well-known Sumerian myths, the point was not that she had acquired a simple document. She had acquired power itself. The Apkallu carried that power directly into the earliest cities of southern Mesopotamia. And what followed was not a slow, stumbling experiment in how to build a society. It arrived, by the account of the people who lived it, already assembled. The sages taught language, they taught agriculture, they taught law and ritual and the management of cities that were growing faster than anything the ancient world had ever seen before. Those achievements alone, appearing so suddenly and so complete, have puzzled historians for a long time. The gap between what came before and what ancient Sumer would soon become is genuinely difficult to explain, but the Sumerians themselves were not puzzled by it. To them, the explanation, like all answers, was already sitting in the texts. The knowledge had been given. The question of where it came from had a clear answer, and silently forming the foundations underneath it all was another gift, the one that may have outlasted every ritual, every law, every carefully maintained temple. Because with them, the Apkallu also brought numbers. Not just counting, exactly. Nothing quite as simple as it appears at first glance. Something more structured and far more deliberate. A truly advanced system, a way of organizing numerical thinking that was built around one particular numerical value as its core unit. A mathematical system that reached out from there to touch everything the Sumerians would come to be: the sky, a circle, the hour, year, and beyond. A system so precisely fitted to the rhythms of the natural world that it did not stay in ancient Mesopotamia. It traveled forward through every civilization that came after, quietly embedded in the way we still divide the minutes of every single passing moment, to this very day. That number, that system, was 60, known as the hexadecimal system. It sounds almost too simple at first, a number, just an ordinary value sitting there in the middle of Mesopotamian clay tablets, pressed into the mud by stylus and intention. But what the Apkallu were passing down wasn't arithmetic in the way we think of it now. It wasn't a tool for bookkeeping, not exactly. What they were teaching was something the ancient mind understood on a much deeper level, another kind of sacred language, a code embedded in the very structure of the world itself, just waiting for someone patient enough and quiet enough to see it. To them, this wasn't a human invention at all. It was a divine revelation, a pattern placed inside reality by the very gods who had created them, and the sages were simply the ones who had been designated to carry it, to protect it, to bring it to all of mankind, and make sure we learn to use it with the right intent. But here's what's really fascinating. They may not have been entirely wrong about that concept, because 60 isn't an arbitrary choice at all. It isn't the kind of number a culture stumbles on by accident, or picks at random because it seemed convenient. 60 is the smallest number that can be divided evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. It also divides cleanly by 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. That's 12 different whole divisors, with nothing left over, no messy remainders, no fractions bleeding into the margins. In a world without decimal points, without calculators, without any of the shortcuts we now take for granted, this was extraordinary. It meant that any portion of time, any stretch of land, any arc of starlight across the sky could be cut into equal pieces, resolved into clean, whole numbers. The universe, through this lens, had no ragged edges. It came apart neatly. It fit together perfectly. To an ancient priest watching the sky from a temple roof, that kind of mathematical elegance wasn't coincidence. It was proof of an underlying intention woven into everything they were, and everything around them. And they had a way of feeling this proof in their own two hands, literally. Imagine it for a moment. A stargazer sitting in the quiet dark long before dawn has even begun to break over the horizon. The stars are still turning. The air is cool. He raises one hand and uses his thumb to press against the individual joints of his other 4 fingers. Each one has 3 joints, 4 fingers, 12 joints total. One hand becomes a counting device, cycling through 12 beats with each pass of the thumb. The other hand tracks how many full cycles have passed, using its 5 fingers as tally marks. 12 counted against 5 gives 60, a complete unit, the mathematics of the cosmos held inside a single pair of human hands, small enough to carry anywhere, precise enough to chart the movements of planets. There's something truly remarkable about that image, something that intertwines our seen and unseen reality, and grounds it to our species in a simple but profound way. The infinite expanse of the sky, measured by the smallest geometry of the human body, which brings us to the circle. And this is where it gets genuinely beautiful. If you take 6 equilateral triangles, each with interior angles of 60 degrees, and arrange them so they share a common center, they fill a perfect circle without any gap, without any overlap. 6 triangles, 6 times 60 degrees, 360 degrees total. Then ancient astronomers applied this geometry to the horizon, dividing the full arc of the sky into 12 equal sectors of 30 degrees each, a single act that gave birth to structures we still live inside every single day. The 12 divisions of the celestial horizon became the 12 months of the year, And the doubling of those 12 sectors, once for daylight and once for night, gave us the 24-hour day. Each of those hours was divided into 60 minutes, each minute into 60 seconds. Every time you glance at a clock, every time you check how long until something begins or ends, you are using a mathematical grid that was laid down in the very heart of ancient Mesopotamia, by people counting on their fingers under a sky full of gods. But the system didn't stop at seconds and hours. It scaled upward too, into ranges of time so vast they become difficult to hold in the mind. The Sumerians built nested units outward from 60, in a hierarchy of expanding scale. The gesh was 60 itself, the base unit. The ner was 600, or 10 gesh stacked together. The sa was 3,600, equal to 60 squared, and it represented the foundational unit for measuring truly enormous spans of time. With this system, the same mathematical language that measured a cup of grain could also describe the multi-thousand-year reigns of antediluvian kings, as recorded in the ancient king lists. Reigns stretching across hundreds of thousands of years, all expressed in a precise and orderly value. One system, one elegant nested structure, capable of measuring the pour of barley into a bowl, all the way up to the slow turning of entire astronomical ages, without ever switching to a different language, or a different set of rules. Before this, the night was simply immense, unbroken, a darkness with no handles to hold. But by comparing base 60 against the sky, something changed. The infinite became divisible. The overwhelming became measurable. A priest could now point to a specific degree of the horizon and say, with confidence, that a particular star would rise there on a particular night, at a particular hour, at a particular minute. The dark expanse of the universe didn't shrink, but for the first time it had a shape, it had proportion, it had rhythm. And rhythm, even on a cosmic scale, is something a human mind can rest inside of. Our consciousness is designed to find patterns. And that may have been the most important gift of all, not just calculation, but the quiet settling feeling that the sky above was ordered, that it followed rules, and that those rules could be understood, could be utilized and implemented. But the sky alone wasn't the only thing they were reaching to understand. Somewhere between the vast tsar of deep time and the brief count of a single night, they needed another layer of structure, another means of holding both the temporary and eternal together in the same frame. To do that, they would need something more than numbers alone. They would need a higher vantage point, a wider perspective from which the whole design could finally be seen. And that wider perspective, as it turned out, required something physical, something you could climb. The plains of southern Mesopotamia offered almost nothing in the way of natural elevation. No hills to speak of, just a flat, hazy expanse of river mud, stretching to every horizon, with thick morning mists rolling in off the marshlands, and a fine pale dust that hung in the air long after the wind died. If you wanted to see the sky clearly, truly clearly, you had to rise above all of that. And so, in what might be one of the most ambitious decisions in the history of early architecture, the Sumerians simply decided to build their own mountains, not metaphorical ones, actual towering and terraced structures of sun-baked clay, rising tier by tier above the flat earth beneath them. These were the ziggurats of antiquity, and they were not built merely for the sake of grandeur, though they were certainly grand. They were built because the sky demanded a higher place of observation, and the priests who studied that sky understood, on some level, that elevation was a form of precision. But the labor it took to get it done was staggering to consider. Workers hauled woven reed baskets filled with wet river clay, layer after layer, compressing and stacking courses of mud brick with thick mats of bundled reeds pressed between them. Those reed layers weren't decorative. They gave the whole structure a kind of elasticity, allowing it to flex slightly with the ever-shifting waterlogged ground beneath it, rather than cracking apart from instability and the hot rays of the sun. The exterior was sealed with bitumen, that thick black pitch drawn from natural seeps in the earth, fragrant and slightly acrid in the summer warmth, creating a surface that was both waterproof and unmistakably of this place in this particular corner of the ancient world. It smelled of the earth it rose from, even as it reached upward towards something far beyond it. These structures spread far and wide across the Mesopotamian plain, with a kind of quiet inevitability. Wherever a Sumerian city took root, a ziggurat eventually followed. The knowledge of how to build them, how to align them, and how to use them traveled through the temple schools known as the Edubba, which translates roughly as House of Tablets. These were the scribal and priestly academies, institutions of a lost age, where young men learned mathematics, astronomy, ritual, and the management of time itself. They spread from the ancient temple at Eridu, which had been dedicated to Enki, and considered by the Sumerians to be the oldest sacred site in the world, all the way to the famous White Temple rising over Uruk after the flood. And all the while, the Edubba carried the tradition forward, each new generation of priests inheriting both the buildings and the knowledge of what to do with them. What the builders of those temples did, first and most critically, was orient them. Because before a single foundational brick was laid, surveyors had already spent considerable effort aligning the structure itself to align with the four cardinal directions. And they did it with a precision that still draws curious comments from modern researchers. They accomplished this using tools of almost disarming simplicity. A straight wooden pole driven into the ground, called a gnomon, would cast a shadow throughout the day, and by carefully marking where that shadow pointed at specific moments, a surveyor could establish a true north-south line. At night, they tracked circumpolar stars, those that never dip below the horizon, watching their slow rotation around the celestial pole, and using that movement to check and refine their alignments. Those finished monuments, some of the largest structures of the ancient world, were anchored to the geometry of the earth itself through nothing more than careful observation and patient calculation. That alignment was not incidental. It was the whole point. As the seasons turned and the months passed, the shadows cast by the ziggurats' sharp-stepped edges swept across the broad lower terraces with a slow, measurable regularity. The angle of the shadow at dawn on a specific morning told the watching priest something specific and actionable. The sun clearing the eastern corner at a particular angle meant the spring equinox had arrived. A shadow of a certain length at midday meant the solstice was approaching. The building itself was functioning as a calendar, a massive, immovable instrument for reading the year. And the communities living in its shadow, farmers planning their planting, merchants timing their journeys, officials scheduling festivals and offerings, all of them relied on this information. The ziggurat was doing, in stone and shadow, what the clay tablets were doing in cuneiform. It was holding time in a form that could be read, could be touched, and felt and observed by all. And at the very top of these structures, in the most revered placement, sat the highest sanctuary. It was often plastered smooth with white gypsum, and on a clear night it caught the silver light of the moon in a way that made it visible from a considerable distance across the plains. At dawn, the first pale gold of sunrise would touch it before reaching anything else in the city below. This elevated chamber was understood as a meeting place, a threshold where the divine could descend and mortals could, if only briefly, connect with the spiritual realm. The priests known as the Baru gathered there, wrapped in heavy wool against the night chill, watching the sky with a practiced and unhurried attention. Below them, the scent of cedar incense drifted upward from the lower terraces, mixing with the dry smell of sun-warmed brick with the faint, resinous tang of bitumen sealing the outer walls. It was a sensory world set deliberately apart from the noise and the dust and the bustling of the city below, a place where the distinction between the practical and the sacred simply dissolved, because in the Sumerian understanding of things, there had never really been a distinction to begin with. The stars moved according to divine will. The calendar reflected that movement, and the ziggurat, standing at the center of the city, was the instrument that translated one into the other, creating a sacred, timeless sanctuary cradled between the soil of the earth below and the stars above. And from those massive structures, we get a glimpse of how these ancient stargazers transformed the raw observations taken from the peaks of their towering temples into the world's first formal calendar. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Not a rough sense of the seasons, not a general feeling that winter was coming. A structured, deliberate system for measuring time, built from nothing but careful eyes, patient minds, and the slow turning of the sky overhead. It began at dusk on the highest terraces of the great temple houses. As the last light of the sun drained out of the western horizon, priests and trained observers would take their positions and wait. They were watching for something they called the inbu, the first faint waxing curve that comes after a new moon. That delicate silver sliver that appears for just a short window of time, low in the sky, easy to miss if you weren't looking. And when it appeared over that distant horizon, it wasn't just a celestial event, it was a signal. Ram's horns sounded from the high terraces, and the sound rolled down through the city streets below. A new month had begun. Nanna, the moon god, had shown his face, and life in the city reorganized itself accordingly. Merchants updated their records. Temple officials adjusted their schedules. Farmers marked another cycle on their mental ledgers, all of it triggered by that single, quiet sliver of waxing crescent moonlight. This kind of vigil happened every month, without interruption, and over time, those observations accumulated into something more precise. Ancient astronomers came to understand that the moon completed its full cycle from new to full and back again in roughly 29.5 days. You can't have half a day in a calendar, so they did what any careful mind would do. They alternated. One month would be 29 days, the next would be 30, then 29 again. 12 of those months strung together gave them a year of 354 days. And for a while, that was enough. Every phase of the moon served as a visible shared clock face, stretched across the night sky. The rise of the new moon meant the start of a new month. The swelling half-disk meant the month was deepening. The full moon overhead meant they were at the midpoint, when every farmer in the fields, every shepherd watching a flock on the open plains, could look up and know exactly where they stood in time. There was something quietly reassuring about that. The sky itself was the calendar. No one had to carry anything or remember anything complicated. The information was simply always there, overhead, written in the very light streaming down from the heavens above. But there was one problem remaining, the kind of problem that didn't announce itself all at once. The lunar year of 354 days was 11 days shorter than the solar year of 365. That gap doesn't sound like much. But let it run uncorrected for a few years, and the calendar starts to drift. Harvest festivals begin landing in the wrong season. The planting ceremonies that were supposed to align with the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates start slipping earlier and earlier, year by year. Within a generation, the sacred calendar and the actual agricultural reality would be completely out of step. This was not an abstract concern. For a civilization that depended on the land, a misaligned calendar was a serious threat. So the stargazers watched for something else. Certain stars, certain clusters. When they appeared on the eastern horizon just before sunrise, and after a period of invisibility, they served as reliable markers of where the solar year actually stood. And the star cluster known as mul.apin, which we call the Pleiades today, was one of the most important of these. When its heliacal rising didn't match where the calendar said it should be, that was the signal. The sun and moon had drifted out of alignment again. And when that happened, the king would issue a royal decree adding a 13th month to the year. They called it the Dirig, a leap month inserted to bring the lunar calendar back into harmony with the solar one. The decision wasn't arbitrary. It came from sustained observation, from comparing what the sky was actually doing with what the calendar predicted it should be doing, and then correcting the difference between. That's a form of scientific thinking, even if it was wrapped in the mythological language of gods and divine will. This lunisolar calendar governed almost every corner of Mesopotamian life. The spring equinox marked the Apkallu, the sacred New Year festival, which coincided with the swelling of the great rivers, the flooding of the dark river silt onto the fields, and the beginning of planting season. Time wasn't something that simply happened to people without context. It was something that could be understood, tracked, and worked with. A sacred rhythm that guaranteed the fields would flood again, and the grain would grow again, and the world would continue turning in the way it always had. And the record-keeping that held all of this together was considered sacred and holy work, so sacred that even the gods themselves were said to aid in this task. Because somewhere in those vast plains it is said that the lady Nisaba, the goddess of grain and writing, and the reading of stars, presided over a temple in an ancient city they called Uruk, a place whose exact location has been swallowed by time and sand. But the name of that temple is still known. It was called mul, the House of Stars. There, under her divine patronage, scribes maintained detailed lunar tables, tracking monthly observations and compiling official calendar decrees that were then sent out to distant cities all across the empire. From the marshlands of Eridu near the sparkling southern seas to the vast open plains of the north, every community received the same calculations, the same corrections, the same shared measure of time. The calendar wasn't just a small local tool. It was the thread that connected their entire civilization to a single, synchronized understanding of exactly what place in time they held in the great turning of the cosmos. And with that revelation, it became something more than a counting of days. Time itself became a shared pulse, felt from one end of the land to the other. A quiet agreement between every city, every temple, every farmer watching the horizon for the right moment to plant his seeds. And through all of it, from the very first moment mankind took its first breath, to the many Sars that spanned the antediluvian kingdom, it all started with curious people simply standing in the dark, looking up, Hold that picture in your mind for just a moment. Let the darkening silhouette of ancient Mesopotamia materialize before your eyes, like a half-remembered dream, rising steadily out of the fog of deep antiquity. Vast rolling plains nearing the middle of the night, grasslands and deserts and marshlands spreading from the southern shores to the northernmost reaches to the tall jagged mountains in the east. A landscape that came 3,000 years before anything we'd recognize, stretching out in every direction. Flat, immense, absolutely silent in the way that only very old places can be, and rising out of that flatness, tall platforms, artificial mountains of hard-baked clay, whitewashed and pale, catching the last breath of the setting sun before the stars take over entirely. This is where the watching began. Not in libraries, not in lecture halls. Up here, on the highest point anyone could see for miles, where a person could stand and feel the full weight of the sky pressing down upon their shoulders, yet somehow lifting their spirits upward all the same. From that height, ancient Sumer looked nothing like what most people imagine when they think of early civilization. Looking down from those high terraces, the astronomers would have seen a world full of life and color, even at the edge of night. Date palm groves stretched out below in long, rustling rows, their fronds catching the last of the evening wind. Emerald marshlands spread wide to the south, threaded through with still water and the sounds of rustling reeds and native birds settling into their nesting places. Fields ran in every direction, broken up by the clean geometric lines of irrigation canals that carried the river's water further inland, turning what should have been dust into something that could feed an empire. The air coming up from all of it was cool and a little damp, carrying the smell of river silt and blooming nocturnal flowers and the faint sweetness of orchards somewhere below in the dark. It was not a barren world, it was a breathing one. And then there was the sky above it, which on a clear Mesopotamian night would stop almost anyone cold. The stars over the flat river plain are not the stars most of us see now, dimmed by city light and haze. They were everywhere, dense and brilliant, and arranged in patterns so consistent that you could slowly begin to trust them, to feel in them something that resembled order. And even more spectacular was their bright image translated into the rivers below, in the cool waters of the Euphrates and the Tigris, and the wide glassy surfaces of the surrounding marsh lagoons, which caught the light of the midnight sky and held it like a mirror, a reflection so still and so complete that the stars above and their likenesses below became almost indistinguishable. Standing on the high terrace, a person could look out and see the horizon dissolve, sky merging with water until the platform itself seemed to float, suspended in the middle of something endless and dark and scattered with silver light. The boundary between up and down stopped being obvious, no mere metaphor to the people who stood there to witness it. It was what they actually saw. It was the condition they worked in. And they had designated a specific group of people to immerse themselves in it, the ones doing the watching and the recording and the observing. They had a collective name and a sacred role. They were the Baru, a class of priest-astronomers whose responsibilities were deeply revered. As twilight faded and the city below settled into its nighttime quiet, the Baru would climb the whitewashed staircases of the ziggurat in their dark and heavy wool cloaks, stepping carefully, taking their time. There was no hurry in this work. Hurry would have defeated the purpose entirely. And upon reaching the highest open-air terrace, they entered something that looked very much like a deep state of meditation. of cognitive flow, standing still, allowing their eyes to adjust to the shadows, and letting the world below them simply slip away until only the sky remained. The city was sleeping. The palm trees were dark shapes against a darker horizon, and up here, alone with the stars, the Baru kept silent watch. The instruments they carried were simple in their materials, but careful in their design. Straight rods of polished wood or hollow reed served as sighting tools. They would be held up at arm's length to track the precise angle of a rising star. Copper rings were formed into careful circles, helping to align their gaze with consistency, night after night. And on the terrace itself, shallow clay basins filled with still water created an artificial horizon that was perfectly level, evened out in a way that the land below never quite could be. By watching the exact moment a star's reflection touched the surface of the water, the Baru could translate the movement of the sky into something repeatable, something measurable, something that could be written down and checked against the night before, and the night before that. The geometry was not complicated in its tools, but it was exact in its intention. To these observers, the reading of the sky had a name and a nature. They called it the Shatir Samami, which carried a meaning that translates to something like the writing of the heavens. Every constellation slowly drifting across the deep dark tapestry, every planet holding its steady course among the fixed stars, every faint point of light that appeared and vanished with the seasons, all of it was understood as a language of its own. The gods had written omens into those shifting celestial seas, and the Baru were the ones trained to decipher it, to read it, to give it meaning that could be understood. This was not just a meaningless exercise meant to comfort a population who didn't know any better. It was understanding far beyond them. It was an act of reverence carried out in complete stillness, by devoted minds positing themselves to reach into the upper realms, watching the stars above reflect their image below. And the quiet feeling that the cosmos, in all its vast turning and returning, was something that they could be one with. And so, every day when the bustle of the cities slowly came to rest, the Buru kept vigil. But only after the sun descended behind the western marshlands, in the way it does in flat river country, where there are no hills to interrupt it, where the horizon simply opens wide and receives the fading light like a slow exhale. The sky above Eridu shifted from amber to something deeper, a wash of indigo spreading from the east, while the west still held faint traces of rose and copper. Hearth fires began to glow in the clay courtyards below, small and warm, casting long soft shadows across the avenues between the buildings. The city did not go dark so much as it simply changed its quality of light. A quieter light, a gentler one, the kind that asks nothing of you but to feel your mind relax in its soft embrace. Inside the tablet houses, the last of the scribes set down their reed styluses for the night. There was no ceremony to it, just the small, familiar sound of a tool placed against a mat, and then stillness. The clay tablets rested in their long rows, freshly inscribed, slowly curing in the night air. And the numbers pressed into them, the star positions, the careful markings of lunar cycles, all of it lay quietly inside the earth they were made from, held safe. The knowledge was not going anywhere. It would still be there in the morning, and the morning after that, and for thousands of years beyond any single night. Step outside the tablet houses, and the landscape offered its own kind of quiet conversation. The Euphrates moved slowly in the darkness, catching faint starlight along its surface. The tall reeds along the banks shifted in the night breeze, a low and steady sound, less like rustling and more like breathing. The canal water lapped at the muddy banks in a rhythm so slow and so consistent that it became something you stopped noticing after a while. Something that simply folded into the background of the night, like a heartbeat you forget is yours. The air still carried the scent of sun-kissed clay that had been baking all day, and was now releasing that warmth slowly back into the night. Cedar resin still drifted down from the high altars of the ziggurats, faint and sweet, mixing with river silt and the green smell of the marshlands stretching out in every direction. Those ancient cities resided inside something larger than themselves now. That was the difference. Before the careful work of those astronomers and scribes, the night had simply been the night, vast and unmeasured, generous with its stars, but offering no clear structure, no sense of reassurance. Now the darkness had a shape to it. The hours had names. The moon's position had meaning that could be written down, compared, and predicted. The cosmos still turned as it always had, but now there were people below who understood its rhythm well enough to move with it, rather than staying stagnant and uncertain. And that understanding did not make the sky smaller. If anything, it made the night feel safer, orderly, like a silent, unanimous agreement between the heavens above and the earth below. The stars that crossed over the skies of Eridu that night are the same stars crossing the sky right now, a realization that tends to arrive quietly, without announcement, but it lands somewhere deep when it does. Knowing that the very first ancient astronomers to look up at the sparkling tapestry turning overhead had found the same image that anyone looking up tonight will find. The constellations they named, the cycles they tracked, the numbers they pressed into clay, all of it is still running, still turning, still marking the hours in the same patient way it always has. The cosmos does not hurry. It never has. And there is something in that, something settling about the sheer permanence of it all. Thoughts have a way of loosening at this hour. Barriers that felt solid earlier in the day begin to soften at the edges, the way mist rises from still water in the early morning, and simply disappears into the air without any particular effort. The conscious mind, when it finally allows itself to let go, drifts somewhere quieter than thought, somewhere outside of any tangible realm and into the language of the universe itself. And all the while, the stars remain overhead, steady and unhurried, just as they were to the first people who ever thought to watch them with care. And the night holds everything gently, the way it always has, the way it always will. And as the dark space above continues its slow wheel, a quiet reflection settles over the land, for the stillness of the night is not an ending. It is a soft threshold leading toward an even broader horizon, because beyond the immediate silence of those ancient riverbanks, the story of human curiosity expands ever outward, and the early foundations laid down under those deep skies were only the beginning of a much longer journey, a journey driven by a quiet desire to understand our place within the grand design of the universe. In every age, there are those who feel drawn to look beyond the immediate boundaries of their world. Minds that seek order within the vast expanse, looking for meaning in the quiet movements of light, across the dark. What began as simple moments of patient observation slowly grew into a deep, enduring relationship between human thought and the cosmos itself, forming a relationship that did not fade with the passing of centuries. Instead, it moved forward quietly, gathering strength across generations like a slow tide. The subtle wisdom gained under those early skies left behind a delicate trail, winding through time, and waiting to be rediscovered. A trail marked by quiet dedication, profound reverence, and a shared feeling of wonder that transcends the boundaries of any single era. And as we rest within this calm atmosphere, we begin to glimpse the true scope of that ancient pursuit. We start to see that the dark sky overhead holds far more than simple patterns of light. It holds the silent memory of our earliest inquiries and the keys to a much larger story, one that continues to unfold, guiding our thoughts gently toward the endless mysteries waiting just past the visible edge of the horizon. After all, what if every single star we see scattered across the night sky is not just a silent point of light drifting through an empty void, but a small clue pointing towards something far larger and far more intentional, waiting just beyond the visible horizon? What if they are a part of a deeper wisdom that has been at the center of everything all along? Written across the heavens in sacred geometry and silver starlight since the very beginning. It sounds like a strange question to ask at first. At least, it is until we adjust our sight by even the slightest degree. Because every time we look from a different perspective, we keep finding things that don't quite fit conventional theory. Instead, we find something that looks less and less like a totally random mixing of energy, and atoms, and chaos, and more like the organized patterns of an immense cosmic map, one that, oddly enough, our oldest ancestors had already started to decipher, long before the very concept of science or astronomy had even been invented. And if we pause to listen carefully to the echoes of our past, we can still hear their whispers, whispers spoken in a dead language, whispers of a society so far removed from our own that it literally vanished from the historical record for well over 1,800 years, until archaeologists just started finding their remnants less than 2 centuries ago, unearthing the ruins of dusty libraries and vast temple archives buried in the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, in the cradle of early life. And there they found what could be the first cities and the first written records known to all mankind, records written not in paper and ink, but in the sun-cured clay of the earth itself, in cuneiform symbols designed to withstand the true test of time, left behind by a civilization so advanced that somehow they seemed to already understand some of the deepest and most foundational astronomical secrets of the study as a whole. Secrets that were said to hold the destinies of entire empires. Those are the secrets that sit at the center of tonight's exploration. Not a ghost story, not a conspiracy layered over a thin foundation of guesswork. Something documented, something genuinely strange, and in many ways more extraordinary than any legend that has been built around it since. Because the truth behind what the astronomers of ancient Sumeria actually knew, and how precisely they knew it, is one of the more quietly astonishing chapters in the entire history of human thought. Yet time and time again, conventional standards tend to paint early civilizations as primitive watchers of the sky, people who looked up with wonder and wove tall tales around what they saw. Simple observers drawing simple conclusions, gathering around the fire to name clusters of stars after animals and heroes and dreams. And that version of the story is not entirely wrong, but it is profoundly incomplete. Because the people who were there from the very start, populations that stretched far and wide from the primeval marshlands of ancient Sumer all the way to the grand ziggurats of later Babylonia, Akkad, and Assyria. Those people did not merely admire the stars with passive fascination. They revered them. They studied them with the same level of dedication as a devout priest, solemnly reciting his prayers, recording nearly every observation and newly gained insight into meticulous archives, mapping the dark expanse of space into coordinated geometric pathways, tracking planetary movements with a degree of mathematical accuracy that still leaves scholars in quiet awe. These were not passive observers watching time pass them by. They were actively charting the deepest reaches of the visible cosmos, tracing orbital paths, and deciphering what they understood to be a complex celestial blueprint, one that connected the movements of heaven directly to the fate of everything that resided below. And the question that sits underneath all of this, the question that makes serious researchers genuinely pause, is a simple one. How? How did a civilization at the very dawn of recorded history develop a science so mathematically precise that its foundations still echo through every field of modern astronomy to this day? And what greater meanings did they interpret in those celestial depths? That's the trail we're going to follow tonight. A deliberate path through our collective memory. One that has taken historians quite a while to piece together, and we're still just getting through the surface of things, because the only physical evidence we have to point to begins in the dust, and the broken fragments they left for us to find. Just imagine trying to sort through the remnants of a 19th century excavation site, somewhere in the ruins of ancient Nineveh, in what is now northern Iraq, diggers moving through collapsed corridors, and buried archive rooms pulling fragments of clay tablets from the debris of a royal library. Walls that had not seen daylight in over 2,000 years. This was the legendary library of King Ashurbanipal, an Assyrian ruler who made it his life's work to collect and preserve all the accumulated written knowledge of the ancient world, preserving its memory, its culture, its wisdom. Thousands of clay tablets, many of them shattered by the collapse of the library's roof, were pulled from the earth and shipped to the British Museum in London. And among them were detailed star maps, precise planetary observation tables, celestial compendiums stretching back centuries, and a circular clay tablet now catalogued as artifact K8538, which scholars would come to recognize as something truly extraordinary, a sort of early precursor to the function of a planisphere, if you will, one of the oldest known astronomical instruments ever discovered. These are just a few silent remnants of a science so carefully maintained, so methodically recorded, that it survived the collapse of the very civilization that created them, buried in fine desert dust for millennia, waiting to be read again. Tiny wedge-shaped marks, the living messages of those that lived 5,000 years before us, and encoded in those marks the precise coordinates of their stars, measured angles, intelligent notations, tracked movements, a record not of myth or prayer, but of careful observation, repeated and stretched across generations of diligent watchers, standing in the darkness of a moonless night from their high mud-brick platforms, eyes turned upward, instruments raised toward the sky. Now these were not any kind of instruments we would currently recognize, for there were no glass lenses, no metal tubes, no computed calculations running in the background. But what they did have were sighting reeds, copper rings, and polished water basins to track the reflections of stars against something grounding, something that stood still. Simple tools by any modern measure. And yet, with those tools they tracked the intricate orbital loops of planets across years and decades and centuries beyond. They mapped meteor paths and recorded star coordinates with an accuracy that researchers still struggle to explain. An ancient priesthood, standing barefoot on a ziggurat in the dark, calculating the subtle repeating rhythms of the heavens. Generation after generation, they gazed on with a patience that closely reflected the immense spans of their grand empires, watching and recording across enough centuries and through enough time that the patterns became undeniable. But there is something else hidden in that steadfast nature, a hint to where it all came from, one that they did not intend to be a quiet suggestion, but rather a unified acknowledgement of something they did not want us to forget. Something that appears again and again in every text, and every artifact and every relic they left in their wake, that the wisdom they had built over millennia was not theirs alone to claim, that even the most distant ancestors they themselves could remember were simply preserving something far older than themselves, a knowledge that had been handed down from a time even they could barely recall, from an age when the gods themselves walked openly among them and first taught them the language of the sky. Any honest scholar will tell you that the questions this has stirred up have no clean answer. People have theorized and expounded on everything from ancient aliens to lost technology and more. Some agree, and some find it all too far-fetched, but in the long run perhaps that is the point, that we keep asking, keep pondering and theorizing and searching with an open mind, that we keep looking up into the same deep blue pools of reflection and wondering why it all is the way it is and how it all started, because somewhere underneath it all there does lie a shred of truth. If you are listening to this in the quiet of night, let us know where and when you are joining us from in the comments section below. It is quietly comforting to realize that listeners across distant lands and different time zones are all settling into the same quiet journey through the forgotten echoes of human history. If you enjoy this History for Sleep narrative, consider subscribing to the channel or join the Legends of the Dawn membership for uninterrupted narratives. Your support helps our efforts to keep bringing you these ancient stories each week and continue reaching others who are searching for the same calm place to relax and unwind. So if your eyes feel heavy, let them fall closed slowly, softly, and let the image start to shift. The light of day grows softer, and the familiar shapes of the modern world begin to blur at the edge. The air cools, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of moving water rises slowly from beneath the silence, as if the earth itself is remembering something. The dust of those silent archives settles around you, and the boundaries of time begin to loosen their grip. Centuries dissolve into one another, like river silt carried downstream. The night sky above deepens, and the stars are sharper now, clearer, during an age with only the moonlight and the glimmer of a warm fire to soften their glow. Together we drift backward through time, past the great Assyrian palace walls, past the Babylonian astronomers bent over their tablets in the lamplight, further still, toward the first true watchers of the sky, before the flood. In a sunlit sanctuary of the antediluvian era, where priests began to take the early advancements of the first few primeval capitals to new heights, here we witness a city defined by the duality of the roaring waters, which split it down its very center, a place that was best known for basking in the golden warmth of the light, but whose true magic, interestingly enough, belongs to the night, where the first true watchers of the heavens kept constant vigil. There, materializing slowly through the haze of centuries, rising up from the flat Mesopotamian plain, like something half-remembered, is the city of Sippar, the solar city and the fourth primeval capital of the era. It had been designated as the eminent domain of Utu, the sun god, whom the Babylonians would later call Shamash, and was said to be a place where the blazing rays of the sun governed every waking hour, where the night, quiet and vast and speckled with countless heavenly orbs, belonged entirely to the astronomers. Sippar was a twin city in many ways, divided cleanly down its center by a branch of the mighty Euphrates, a river that was not merely a backdrop, it was the lifeblood of trade, splitting it in two while simultaneously connecting it to the wider world around them. Situated at a strategic crossroads to the north of what would later become the heart of Babylonia, merchants arriving here found themselves at the meeting point of two great routes, where those winding currents eventually joined in with the Tigris not far off, giving travelers and traders access to northern roads that would guide them as far as the Anatolian and Assyrian plateaus, the Jazira Plains, the Middle Euphrates, and beyond. It was a city that didn't just endure the hot rays from above, it thrived in them. A complex gridwork of irrigation canals ran out in every direction, feeding lush vegetation that draped the mud-brick terraces in green, soaking up the sun. But Sippar was much more than just a merchant city. It was also a legendary center of ancient wisdom, temple scholarship, and what the people of Mesopotamia revered as some of their most sacred archives. Its very name, many believed, carried echoes of the Akkadian word sipru, meaning writing or inscription, and those words carried more weight than they might first suggest. Because throughout the deepest memories of Mesopotamian lore, Sippar held a singular and extraordinary placement. According to sources ranging all the way from the Sumerian Kings list to the later traditions of the Babylonian priest Berossus, this city had been chosen by the gods themselves to serve as a kind of time capsule. While the great flood was building on the horizon, it was here that the wisest men gathered every clay tablet they could find. Every record, every calculation, every sacred formula, and carefully buried them in the earth, a desperate act of preservation, just before the waters surged. But the question of how Sippar had accumulated such an astonishing wealth of knowledge in the first place leads to a story that is, even by the standards of ancient myth, truly remarkable, a story that survives in the artifacts we have recovered. From the ritual tablet of the diviners to the third tablet of the incantation series of Beit Meseri, the Uruk list of kings and sages among others, it appears again and again. A tale about the seventh king chosen by the gods to guide the antediluvian empire of ancient Sumer, a sovereign named Enki, who ruled over the solar city of Sippar long before the great flood of legends, and the words they recorded about him were both direct and strange in equal measure. They describe a night when Enki and his wise sage, the last of the divine Apkallu, literally ascended to the heavens, arriving in the brilliant assembly halls of the Anunnaki themselves, to stand before the presence of Shamash, the sun god, and Adad, the storm god. And there he was given the knowledge of the holy May, the sacred language of the universe itself, formed from the primordial ether of a world that came before mankind, before there was space to breathe or light to see, before even the Anunnaki themselves. Rules said to govern all of reality, containing every bit of wisdom ever needed to achieve a truly flourishing civilization. Secret mathematical techniques, the mystical craft of divination, the deeper underlying mechanisms by which the cosmos communicated its intentions to those willing to listen. And then the gods commanded him to carry this wisdom back down to the earth below, a gift to be passed on to his descendants, written, preserved, and protected. And what followed was the beginning of something extraordinary, because it was shortly after his return that the ancient world experienced a level of growth that, even with all their prior advancements, had never been seen before. Picture the Baru, the seer priests of Sippar, settled onto the high mud-brick terraces, looking out over the land below, and more importantly, the sky above, in the absolute stillness of the desert night, the air cool and dry against the skin, the thick scent of burning cedar resin drifting effortlessly through open temple corridors, mingling with the faint sweetness of desert flowers carried in a gentle breeze. And beneath all of that, the soft rhythmic sound of reed styluses pressing the exact coordinates of distant stars, and the clusters formed therein, into damp river clay, and advancing the mathematical language and pragmatic sciences that started in the marshlands of Eridu, precise, methodical, and eternally patient in the way that those know their duties to be sacred must be, a patience that spans generations, the kind of dedication that comes from understanding, without a doubt, that you are merely the record-keeper of something much larger than yourself. Not something that was simply fabricated into existence, but something that just is, something that runs just beneath the tangible surface, carefully structuring everything we see and everything we are. And nearby, others practice new ways to see that pattern more clearly, hovering silently in a sort of trance. Ancient priests cast their gaze downward to master the esoteric art of lechonomancy, reading beautiful shifting patterns formed from ribbons of pure oil poured slowly over the still surface of cedar bowls filled with water, and watching iridescent shapes contract and expand and dissolve, and trying to decipher what the gods were saying through them. These were the first true watchers, the ones who looked up with intention night after night and wrote down exactly what they saw, and what they would eventually produce. Those records pressed into clay on the dark terraces of some of our oldest ziggurats would become some of the most extraordinary works of scientific and astronomical knowledge in all of early human history. Works that still shape how we understand time, how we practice mathematics, how we read the geometry of the universe itself to this very day. And among everything they recorded, there was a particular group of lights that demanded more attention than all the rest. Not the steady fixed stars, not the quiet, familiar glow of constellations holding their positions night after night. Those were recorded with equal care. But these were something different. 5 specific points of light that refused to stay still, that drifted, shifted, looped back in on themselves, and moved with a kind of deliberate rhythm above the rolling plains of ancient Sumer. The priests watched them from their high temple platforms, burning with a brightness that separated them from everything else the sky had to offer. The ancient astronomers gave these wandering bodies a name of their own, one that carried real weight in the old world. They called them the Bibu, the wild sheep, entities that, like their namesake, don't follow a set path, moving with their own will, their own internal logic, and that's exactly what these lights seem to be doing, wandering through the fixed backdrop of the stars with an independence that the priests could not ignore. They watched, and they took note, and slowly across generations they began to understand that the wandering wasn't random at all. It was coherent, it was predictable, and it was something that could be mapped. By the time the Babylonian astronomers arrived, building on those Sumerian foundations of their ancestors before, the mathematics had become sophisticated enough to do something remarkable. Working with the base 60 numerical system inherited from their predecessors, Babylonian scribes discovered they could track Jupiter's movement across the sky by calculating the area beneath a trapezoid shape. This was, in effect, an early form of the integral calculus, a feat that went unmatched until European astronomers duplicated the math thousands of years later, in the 14th century. Their charts of Jupiter's orbit were accurate to within fractions of a single degree. The other planets were traced just as precisely. and behind each path was a presence. The paths of Mars, with its reddish burning quality, was understood as Nergal, or Error, a god associated with plague and war. Saturn was Ninurta, slow and deliberate, a deity of agriculture and patient order. And then there was perhaps the brightest and most revered star in the sky, other than the moon itself, the star Venus, the morning and evening star. But to the ancient Sumerians there was a radiant feminine presence underneath all that brilliant glow, and they called her Inanna, Queen of Heaven, though she is now largely known under her later Babylonian title, the goddess Ishtar. The scribes who tracked her movements weren't just doing astronomy. They were following a deity through her cycles. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa documents this with a precision that still draws the attention of even the most scrupulous modern researchers. Because for over 20 years, scribes recorded exactly when she rose and set, when she vanished behind the sun and reappeared again. The tablet maps out the full 8-year pentagram cycle symbolic of Venus, with a dedication that required generations of coordinated observation to achieve. And strangely enough, her disappearances were not simply noted as simple astronomical events. There is an even older legend behind her cyclical disappearance. It was believed, throughout nearly all of Mesopotamian lore, to be a reflection of Ishtar's descent to the netherworld, a place called Ker, from which there was said to be no return. But Ishtar did return, and the price of her salvation was that her husband Dumuzi take her place beneath the earth. And it was that very exchange, the sacrifice of substitution, that was believed to set the turning of the seasons into motion. From life to death, through the long, slow rhythm of the year between, all encoded in the passage of a single planetary orbit. And the maps that recorded it, and others, continued to evolve even long after the flood. Empires rose and fell, each one building on the foundations of their ancestors. And then came an artifact unlike almost anything else that had come before it, the planisphere of Nineveh. Recovered from the ruins of the great library of King Ashurbanipal in what is now northern Iraq, this clay tablet takes on a new shape, a circular one instead of the usual rectangular tablet. It divides the entire visible night sky into 8 equal sectors of 45 degrees each, with constellations pressed into small indentations that almost ask you to reach out and trace them with your own fingers to connect the points, and cuneiform notes filling the spaces between. Even meteor paths were marked down, a portable map of the entire night sky, rendered in 360 degrees, a physical object you could hold, rotate, and read, and the positions recorded on it correspond precisely to the sky over ancient Mesopotamia on the night of January 3rd, 650 BCE, precise enough that we can reconstruct exactly which stars were visible and where they sat in the sky on one specific evening, more than 2.5 millennia ago. Every new generation of those watchers passed it on forward. They pressed their observations into clay, and then they handed the tablets to scribes, who copied them, extended them, and added their own careful notes to the growing record, each person looking up at the same star-speckled expanse, doing their best to capture something true about what they saw above them, so that whoever came next would not have to start from the beginning. And so their wisdom grew even more rapidly than before, tablet by tablet, generation by generation, each scribe adding their own careful notes. But even among all of those accumulated observations, all those careful lists of stars, and rising times, and planetary movements, one document would eventually rise above the rest. One compilation that would draw everything together so completely that it became the foundation for nearly every astronomical tradition that followed. And that document was called the mul.apin. It translates roughly as the plough star, named after the very first constellation listed within its opening lines. And what it represents is something genuinely remarkable. This is the oldest surviving comprehensive star catalogue we have left from any ancient culture, excavated from ancient library sites at Nineveh and Ashur, where surviving copies date to around 700 BC. But the observations written inside them date back much, much further than that. The astronomical data encoded in mul.apin reflects a sky so old that it would have looked slightly different from how it appeared in 700 BC because of a slow wobble in Earth's axis called precession. And when researchers worked backward through that wobble, the observations pointed to an original source compiled somewhere around 1200 BC at the very earliest, with even deeper roots likely stretching back into the second millennium and beyond. These weren't new concepts being written down for the first time. They were far older observations and ideas finally being gathered into one place. And hidden inside those long lines of cuneiform, pressed carefully into clay by hands that knew exactly what they were preserving, are lists of 66 distinct stars and constellations, planetary paths, the dates when specific stars rise and set in correlation with the sun, notes on solstices and equinoxes, observations on weather and the seasons of the calendar. It is dense with information, and it rewards slow reading. But perhaps the most elegant thing inside mul.apin isn't any single piece of data. It's the structure underneath all of it. Because the ancient astronomers who built this system didn't just record what they saw, they organized it to find a greater meaning, dividing the entire sky into 3 distinct regions, 3 great paths, each one named after the highest immortals of the Anunnaki Council, and each one governing a fixed portion of the heavens. They called them the Path of Enlil, the Path of Anu, and the Path of Ea, more commonly known as Enki, 3 names that most deep history buffs recognize immediately. Because these weren't minor figures, Enlil, Anu, and Enki were the supreme trinity of the Anunnaki Council, the 3 most powerful gods in all of ancient Mesopotamia, and here they were, carved permanently into the structure of the sky itself. Enlil ruled the northernmost arc, the god of wind and storm, the one who first breathed air into the primordial world, and his domain in the heavens reflected his elevated stature. His northern path contained 33 constellations. And what made it mathematically special was the circumpolar stars at its core. These are the stars that never set. They circle endlessly around the north celestial pole, visible every clear night of the year, never dipping below the horizon. Among Enlil's most important stars was mul.apin itself, the plough which we might recognize today as part of Draco, and the heavenly wagon which corresponds to Ursa Major, the Great Bear. While the other 2 paths intersected at various points in the horizon as their stars rose and set through the seasons, Enlil's path formed a continuously unbroken circle that remained untouched, spinning endlessly around the northern pole. Enki's domain, in direct contrast, lay at the opposite end of the sky. His southern path sat low on the horizon, close to the edge of visibility, where stars appear to rise briefly and then sink back below the line of the earth, kept in perfect place by Enki, the god of deep water and hidden wisdom, the lord of the underground freshwater ocean called the Apsu, and the celestial seas above reflected his sunken watery domain perfectly. Here, the southern path featured 15 constellations, many of them tied to the regenerating waters of the deep. The Great One which we call Aquarius, pouring the waters of life from an overflowing vase. The swallow, which corresponds to Pisces. The sacred fish, which we know as Capricorn. The ancients didn't see any of this as abstract. They understood Enki's path as a literal conduit to the netherworld, the place where the sun descended during the more dormant phase of its journey. Because while Enlil's was the path of the summer sun, when the light travelled through Enki's southern domain, the days shortened, the nights stretched long and cold. The winter solstice had taken hold, and the world waited for the balance to return. And at the center of it all, that balance was held by their father, Anu, ruler of the highest reaches of the heavens and supreme king of the entire Anunnaki Council. His central path spanned the equatorial band of the sky, like a great highway running directly through the middle of the heavens, while his sons governed the seasonal extremes of the year on either end. Anu held the steady center, and it was through his path that the sun, the moon, and the 5 wandering planets of the Bibu made their regular journeys across the sky. His domain was the primary stage for eclipses, for planetary conjunctions, for all the celestial events that carried astrological weight. And when the sun entered the path of Anu, it also triggered the equinoxes, spring and autumn. Those 2 moments in the year when day and night reached perfect equality across the earth. A symmetry that felt deliberate, felt designed. And in the minds of the astronomers who mapped all of this, it mirrored exactly what Anu was supposed to be, the cosmic arbiter, the one who held the balance that lies between. Under his sweeping gaze were 23 major star groups, including great figures like the lion, which we call Leo, Scorpius, and the great twins Gemini, just to name a few. These were royal constellations, lining the central highway where every meaningful planetary event would eventually unfold. But one constellation in the central corridor held a uniquely special position, the mul, a star cluster positioned at the top of the entire Babylonian catalogue, marking the beginning of the new year. The Pleiades, that small, dense cluster of stars that we now call the 7 Sisters, and together they form the shoulder of the Bull of Taurus. But in earlier traditions, the Pleiades were more largely tied to a different group of primordial entities who existed long before the Anunnaki rose to their thrones. The Sibiti, the 7 demons, formless forces of destruction who had once brought chaos to the early world, and who now rested within Anu's central path, as weapons held in reserve, eternal guardians of the cosmic balance. And what these ancient Skywatchers had quietly accomplished was something far bigger than a list of star names, or a conglomeration of mythical symbolism. By mapping all 66 celestial bodies into these 3 divine paths, they had built the world's first complete coordinate system for the sky. A priest sitting atop a quiet temple platform could track the exact night a rising star shifted from Enlil's northern arc down into Anu's central band, and know precisely when to begin the planting, or to prepare for the river's rise. The vastness of the sky had been translated into something ordered, something readable, a map drawn not just in clay but reflected clearly across the heavens themselves. That knowledge didn't stay locked inside temple walls. It moved, it evolved, and buried within their dense columns of cuneiform script was something that would quietly reshape how human beings understood the heavens for the next 3,000 years. Because what the mul.apin texts had also recorded was 18 broader distinct constellations lying along the moon's path across the sky. 18 groupings of stars, each one named, each one tied to a season or a rising time. That number isn't arbitrary. It reflects centuries of careful observation, of watching which stars appeared on the horizon just before the dawn, which ones rose as particular seasons shifted, and which ones vanished below the western edge of the world at predictable intervals. This was real data, accumulated slowly, checked against itself, and refined by astronomers who had no instruments beyond their own eyes, and the base 60 mathematics their culture had perfected over generations. And that hexadecimal system, the same one that gave us 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle, is exactly what allowed Babylonian astronomers to take those 18 uneven star groupings and do something truly remarkable with them, something that would echo throughout all time, something that would be remembered and studied even when the culture who invented it had long since faded into nothing but a distant memory. By dividing the full circle of the sky into 12 equal sectors of 30 degrees each, 12 times 30 equaling 360, they produced a standardized mathematical wheel, one that matched their 12-month lunar calendar almost perfectly. And just like that, across what must have been generations of slow mathematical refinement, the 18 constellations of the mul.apin were merged and streamlined into 12. The world's first true zodiac had taken shape. The very heart of the study of astrology, which, wherein it lacks any empirical scientific backing, has a rich history rooted in ancient science, math, and cultural tracking of time, mapped against very real, very distinct astronomical regions of the night sky, an ancient art that was practiced in one form or another, long before it became tied to modern pop culture, crystals, and mysticism. And what's worth slowing down for is the sheer age of the names themselves, because this is where the star maps start to feel strangely familiar. As the zodiac became more well known, this was when the constellation the ancient scribes used to call Guana, meaning the bull of heaven, became what we now call Taurus. The Mastubu, or the Great Twins, became Gemini. The Great One, the water-bearer, became Aquarius. Scorpio, Virgo, Pisces, Sagittarius, each one carrying a cuneiform name that predates the Greek labels we still use today, by thousands of years. These weren't symbols invented for decoration. They were working tools, positions in a celestial calendar, as functional as the marks a farmer cuts into a post to track the seasons. And that's the part that tends to get lost when people talk about the zodiac now. The original Mesopotamian system had almost nothing to do with personal fortune or daily predictions. It was a macrocosmic mirror held up to the entire civilization. When a constellation completed its heliacal rising, appearing just above the eastern horizon in the moments before dawn, it was a signal, a practical one. When Virgo rose in that way, it told the kingdoms below that the river silt along the Euphrates was ready to be ploughed. When Aquarius dominated the night sky, it warned of the flood season approaching. Heaven and earth weren't separate concerns in this system. They were synchronized, one calendar written in two places at once, one carved into clay, and one hanging overhead in the darkness. And the priests who read it weren't mystics disconnected from daily life. They were the civilization's timekeepers, during an age when the clock they watched was one made of the universe itself. And from all of that, something even larger began to take shape. The precise hexadecimal mathematics, the careful geometry, the centuries of dated star coordinates pressed into clay and stored in the great tablet houses of Sippar and Babylon and Nineveh. All of it was slowly building toward a discovery that no single human being could have made alone. Something that, much like before, required not just one brilliant mind, but an unbroken chain of them, each one passing a torch forward across generations they would never live to see, and could hardly fathom. What those accumulated records eventually made possible was the recognition of one of the deepest rhythms in the universe. A cycle so slow it makes the span of human life feel like a single breath. The precession of the equinoxes. A full rotation taking roughly 26,000 years, sometimes called the Great Year. And the ancient world, through sheer discipline and devotion, had laid the groundwork to find it. You see, the Earth doesn't spin perfectly upright. It wobbles, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the planet's axis traces a wide circle in space, like a top that's beginning to lean, but doing it across tens of thousands of years, rather than a few seconds. That wobble shifts which stars appear in the background of the sky during the spring equinox, at a rate of approximately 1 degree every 72 years. Just one single degree. In a single human lifetime, that shift is essentially invisible. The stars look fixed. The patterns appear permanent. There is nothing in one person's direct experience that would ever suggest the whole backdrop of the heavens is gradually turning. And yet it is. It's turning in a vast silent circle, and it takes around 25,920 years to complete one full rotation. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus is generally credited with calculating this shift sometime in the 2nd century BCE, and that credit is fair. His calculation was precise, and his methods were rigorous. But here's what's fascinating, what often gets left out of the story. Hipparchus didn't discover precession from scratch. He inherited it. To detect a shift of 1 degree every 72 years, you need star catalogues spanning centuries, with reliable dates attached to each observation. You need records old enough that the slow drift finally becomes measurable. And those records existed because primeval Mesopotamian scribes, all the way from the very first astronomers of Eridu to the Baru priests of the great temple complexes of ancient Sumer and Babylon, had already been keeping them without interruption for hundreds of years. Hipparchus compared his own observations against cuneiform star catalogues that were already considered historical relics in his own time, and without those tablets, the shift would have remained invisible. There was simply no other way to see it. But what makes this even stranger yet, in a mathematical sense, in a way that would not have been lost on a Mesopotamian scribe, is how neatly the numbers of precession align with their base 60 arithmetic. 1 degree of the Great Year takes 72 years to pass, and one full astrological age, meaning the equinox moving through 30 degrees of a single zodiac sign, takes 2,160 years. The equivalent of 60 multiplied by 36. Carry that on through, and you find that one complete great year, all 360 degrees, takes 25,920 years. That's 60 multiplied by 432. To a mind already trained to see the universe as a structure built on sexagesimal relationships, this was not a coincidence. It was confirmation. The grandest cycle in the observable heavens was written in the same sacred mathematical language that governed the arc of the night sky, the divisions of the hour, and the geometry recorded on clay tablets and reflected in their intricate city grids. It had always been there, since before writing existed in any recognizable form. Picture a young scribe in Uruk, carefully copying a column of stellar coordinates from a tablet that was already 5 centuries old on the day it was handed to him. The observations he was transcribing were made by a man whose name he didn't know, under a sky that looked almost identical, but oddly offset from his own. He wasn't copying a myth or a prayer. He was copying measurements. Numbers tied to specific stars on specific dates in a specific year. He probably didn't fully understand what those records would one day reveal, but he copied them anyway because that was his solemn duty. That was what was required to see such a greater underlying design, that its influence touches everything all at once and yet barely seems to cause a ripple in anything we can immediately see. And through that quiet discipline, something extraordinary was preserved, because no single astronomer ever watched a constellation drift even one full degree across the sky. Not one of them lived long enough. But together, scribe after scribe, generation after generation, they built a memory that stretched far beyond any individual. And in doing so, they handed us a window into a cycle older than themselves, older than any civilization alive on the face of planet Earth. A memory that was continuously passed on, not as a single revelation, but as something that accumulated slowly, like starlight gathering in still water. Just imagine the sky above ancient Sippar, as the last warmth of the day releases its grip on winding mud-brick streets. The sun drops below the flat horizon, and its amber hues dissolve softly. Without urgency, the way a breath lets go at the end of a long day. And in the space where the light was, something else opens, a deep spreading indigo, the kind of darkness that isn't empty at all, but full of something older than the city below it, full of numerous points of light, each one holding its position with a patience that no living thing has ever matched. Here, the plains of ancient Mesopotamia settle into stillness. The rivers slow, the reeds along the marshy banks stop moving, and the sky, that enormous unbothered sky, simply continues to be what it has always been. There were people who stood in that darkness, deliberately, who climbed the smooth white steps of the ziggurat terraces even after the household fires burned low, and who let their eyes adjust to what was above them. And just like the vast open space above, they weren't in a hurry, for there was no hurry needed. The stars would be where the stars would be, moving the way they always moved, following the same unhurried arc they had followed the night before, and the night before that. These watchers carried their reed stylus and their tablets, yes, but they also just stood there sometimes, looking, breathing the cool air that rose from the rivers, letting the Milky Way wash across the sky overhead like a slow river of its own, running on its own path through the deep vault of heaven, carrying light whose origins came from somewhere unimaginably far away. A vault that moves so gently you can't catch it turning. That's what the ancient astronomers knew. It was something you had to surrender to rather than watch. You couldn't stand there and see it move. You could only look away and look back and find that something had shifted in the space between. A constellation that had been balanced on the eastern edge, now dipping below. A planet that had drifted a small fractional distance from the place it had been the night before. The eternal vault of the heavens never announced itself. It just continued, slow and enormous, and completely unbothered by the human eyes below it, tracing its great wheel through the dark, turning the same way it had turned long before the first city wall was laid, and the same way it would turn long after the last one fell. What they built out of that watching lasted. The names they gave to stars traveled forward through every civilization that came after. The measurements they carved into clay survived the empires that rose and dissolved around them. And the people themselves, the ones who stood in the night air and pressed their observations into wet clay, passed quietly into the same darkness they had spent their whole lives studying. Society after glimmering society, empire after empire. They gave their collective wisdom to whoever came next, and the stars kept moving the way they always had. No faster, no slower, no different than they ever had before, carrying the light forward across the long, unbroken chain of history. So if you find your eyes growing heavy, let them fall closed, knowing that wherever you are, the sky is still turning, still drifting, still calling to your dreams in the same way it always has. The same slow wheel, the same unbothered arc of light, crossing the same deep tapestry that the watchers of Sumer and Babylonia and Uruk once traced with careful eyes. Your thoughts can soften, loosen, and drift. Allow your breathing to match that ancient steady rhythm. A quiet inhale, a long and gentle release. Feel how the weight of all that has passed simply settles beneath you, fading softly like the last light over the rolling plains, where a profound silence stretches across every long mile, inviting your muscles to relax, easing the quiet space behind your eyes and guiding your awareness into a deep and effortless slumber. Each pulse of light overhead becomes a slow, rhythmic beacon, anchoring you in the stillness of the universe. Time loses its edge as those bright clusters hold their ancient guard, carrying their slow geometry through infinity. We are all a part of this grand journey, simply floating within the great expanse, unbound by hours or distance, sinking further into the celestial seas, where the stars keep their gentle, timeless dance. There's nothing to hold on to, for everything is in its proper place. The world is turning at its own quiet, reliable pace. And somewhere in the depth of all that turning, in the long silence between one star and the next, we find ourselves at rest, cradled in the knowledge of all that was and all that will be. And as the dark horizon holds everything between, the quiet currents of the ancient river flow ever onward, soft waters gliding past sleeping banks, carrying the silver reflection of thousands of distant embers downstream. A slow mirror moving through the dusky landscape, merging the earth below with the endless luminous canopy above. Its cool atmosphere gathers around the silent platforms of clay. The last lingering warmth of sun-baked brick slips away into the shadows, replaced by the gentle hush of rustling palm leaves. Everything settles into a deep, effortless stillness. The grand monuments stand quietly beneath the sky, resting as natural forms within a landscape that has surrendered entirely to the moonlight. And all the while, bright clusters glow like soft sparks, drifting through the dark expanse on an eternal path, turning so smoothly, so gently, so slowly, that the boundary between time and space simply fades. The vast sky cradles the earth in an embrace of soft blue hues, where light and shadow blend into a single peaceful expanse. Allow yourself to drift along those quiet celestial currents. Feel how the gentle rhythm of the night carries your awareness further into the quiet spaces between the stars. Like a leaf resting on the surface of a slow river, carried smoothly through the vast expanse of the cosmos, guided by the steady timeless glow that has illuminated the world for countless ages. The stars keep their ancient, watchful guard, shining softly down upon a world at peace. Everything is still. Everything is silent, and deep within their gentle embrace, we simply rest, floating safely in the quiet warmth of a peaceful slumber.